Hello everyone, welcome to Kalam's answer writing. Today's question is question number 58. I opened up the question yesterday and it is related to India-Israel relationship. So I was talking about the different angles of engagement of India and Israel, and we are supposed to discuss the same in the question. I have written out the body and the introduction and the conclusion here. We'll discuss the same. So the first thing you have to establish that there is a certain depth and diversity to the relations between these two countries. As in these two countries have come to a point in which you cannot go back, as in from which you cannot go back. You have to talk about this, and moving forward you also have to talk about the way forward. How can we better the situation between India and Israel? Like for example, India is having good relations with Israel. It is creating some amount of trouble with other Gulf nations. Like for example, Saudi doesn't like the fact that India is too close to Israel. Iran doesn't like the fact that India is too close to Israel. So there are problems, of course. These are the three major powers in that particular Gulf, as in Persian Gulf region. You have the Saudi, the Iran, and then you have Israel. And these three countries are usually at loggerheads with each other. But anyway, you have to balance these three entities. You cannot lean towards any one of these entities because India wants to cultivate good relations with each of these countries. Each of these countries is important to us in a good is in its own way. Like for example, Saudi is important for us in what way? Saudi provides us with a lot of water. Saudi provides us with an investment, and especially in the real estate sector in the Saudi provides us with a lot of oil and not water, and it doesn't even have water. It is a desert. Anyway, Saudi provides us with oil. It provides us with investment, especially in the real estate sector in times to come, as for the recent agreements. And then a lot of diaspora is located in Saudi Arabia, right? In addition to this, you also what does Iran do? Iran, everybody knows about Chabahar port. Everybody knows about Chabahar and Zahedan railway line and so on. And Israel is important in its own way. So all these three powers are important. You cannot lean towards any one power specifically or too much, because it is going to create a trouble with the rest of these powers. So you have to balance your relations between these three set of powers. Now moving forward, you have to discuss this. So how do you introduce your question? How do you write the body of your question, and how do you conclude? In the body of your answer, we have decided that we have to talk about the depth and diversity of the relations, first thing. The next thing we're going to talk about is the way forward, as in the various other ways of engagement between these two countries. These two things I definitely have to talk about. And the conclusion, I have to talk about the balance of powers. And in the introduction, if I want to talk about the relations between India and Israel, probably it would be wise to throw in some light on the idea of historical background between India and Israel. Like for example, India has not always been extremely supportive of Israel, because Israel-Palestine issue was a very important topic, and for a long time India has been sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. And because we've become more realistic in present times, we have decided that look, Palestinian cause has its importance, but at the same time it's not the case that we cannot develop good relations with Israel. We should also develop good relations with Israel because we have a lot to gain. Israel has a lot to provide India, and we have to cash this opportunity. So Palestinian issue is dehyphenated from what? From Israel. So I've been using this term called dehyphenation. Dehyphenation is used in a lot of context. Like for example, USA has its own dehyphenation policy. India can dehyphenate this and that. What do we mean by this dehyphenation, especially in the international relations scenario? Please write it out in the comment section. Let it be visible for everybody else that is going to share some knowledge for everybody. Now let's move forward. Let's look at the sample answer that has been written for this particular question. So India-Israel relations have been rapidly emerging in the past few decades because of political will, realism, common interests, and so on. In addition to this, you could also talk about how India, in the initial times, especially in the first few decades, has been quite hesitant in terms of cultivating good relations with Israel. This is something that you could have written. You could also have drawn the diagram of a triangle in which you have Israel at one end, Saudi at other end, and you have what? Iran at other end. in which India is obviously beach में. It is trying to balance these three powers. This is a diagram that you could draw. It is not a clear diagram. You could draw this clearly and you could show the examiner that India has faced this classic dilemma of balancing its relations between Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, and because of this, India has played this policy of hesitancy and it has not been able to cultivate good relations with Israel as such for a long time. That is something you could have done. Anyway, depth and diversity of Indo-Israel relations is something he's talking here. Israel has been a reliable defense partner compared to the West. Along with missiles and ammunition, Israel also provides for transfer of technology. In fact, you could list down certain missiles here, Barak missile and so on. All these things can be written so that the examiner knows that you have some facts in your arsenal. In addition to this, transfer of technology is a really important point because that is what distinguishes Israel from other countries. Like for example, Russia sends us a lot of defense equipment. True. USA also has given us, in fact, it still gives us a good amount of defense equipment. Similarly, India sources its defense equipment from a lot of places, but mainly from Russia. In fact, 60 to 70% used to be coming from Russia, especially until the last decade. Anyway, but the problem with these two countries is that they don't transfer technology. So whenever the missiles or something comes to a repair, we don't have a solution. We are supposed to buy a new thing, or those people used to come from their own country to our own country and then make and do the repair and so on. Right, but this is a problem. You need to have some transfer of technology, otherwise you will not be able to develop indigenously and you will be forever indebted, forever dependent on the external countries to source your components or to source your technology. And Israel doesn't do that. What Israel does is it transfers the technology, at least in a good measure, if not a complete transfer of technology. In addition to this, what it does instead is it develops from time to time. It develops its own technology, and whatever technology it has developed over the past few years, it transfers those things which it thinks should be transferred, and it does so at a reasonable price, and that is a good strategic depth to the relations between these two countries. Moving forward, Israel provides high technology solutions to our information technology companies and medical equipment manufacturers. Israeli agricultural technology has supported India in drip irrigation, hydroponic farming, greenhouse farming. I want you to write down what hydroponics means, greenhouse farming means. Drip irrigation, of course, everybody knows. Drip irrigation, and then you have the sprinkler irrigation. In fact, they have the capacity to decrease the water consumption by 40%. They come under this concept called micro irrigation. Anyway, in these three new kinds of technology, Israelis have achieved some amount of perfection and they have no problem sharing the same with India. So this has increased some amount of strategic depth between these two countries. Now both the countries have been located amidst hostile neighbors. India has Pakistan, China and so on. Israel has other countries as in its own neighbors of Palestine and so on. So there are some conflicts with their neighbors, and this has led to a situation of insecurity. When you have neighbors who are quite hostile to you, you will definitely develop insecurities, and this is going to trouble you for a long time, right? And if these neighbors are hell-bent on making you vulnerable, on pulling you down on the economic front, on the security front, and so on, you definitely will face trouble. That is what Pakistan is trying to do. Pakistan is trying to bleed India by 1,000 cuts. That is what the newspaper people always tell us. So when you have a hostile neighborhood, it is going to create a situation of panic, and in such a situation, you tend to develop a certain kind of security measures. You tend to develop certain kind of borders, like you maybe fence your borders and then you do coastal patrolling and so on. You develop a security apparatus in itself, and this security apparatus also is an area in which these two countries are cooperating. Now let's move forward. So far, we've talked about certain measures, or as in certain angles of engagement between India and Israel. Now he's talking about other areas of cooperation between these two countries, right? Now you have cooperation in space, you have cooperation in intelligence sharing, academia, industry, government connect, student exchange programs, pharma sector companies, innovation, entrepreneurship, culture. In fact, these are the areas in which a lot of memorandum of understandings have been written down between India and Israel in recent times. You would probably find this in any current affairs magazine, or if you follow the current affairs newspaper as such. Now, these diverse set of relations have boosted the cooperation between these countries. There are, however, certain sticky points between the two countries. One is the problem of bilateral trade. It is quite less compared to the potential Palestinian stand of India. India might have dehyphenated the issue, but it is somewhat sympathetic to the cause of Palestine. So there is some amount of friction from time to time. Next, physical connectivity is poor because Israel is quite far off from India, and then the limited people to people ties. So these are the sticky points, and in such a situation, you have to show a way forward. First, you have to increase the investments in education, tourism, and so on. You have to balance the relations with Israel and other regional powers like Saudi Arabia and so on. This could have been written in the conclusion. Anyway, high-level meetings and discussions to gauge further areas of cooperation. So these are generic points. This point is very nice, second point, but in fact that could have been written as a part of your conclusion in relation instead of writing history of hesitation. But history of hesitation is also a good point, but that could have been written in the introduction, like I just said in the previous slide. Anyway, in this question there is something missing. I wanted to point that out, and that is nothing but the fact that you cannot go back from the present relation. Of course, it is not a huge point. It could evolve into a small subheading under which you can write 2 or 3 points. You could tell why you cannot go back from this present scenario. You cannot go back from this present scenario because this situation is profitable for both the countries. It is a situation of win-win. Secondly, both the countries are sharing counterintelligence information and intelligence sharing, and this has led to a situation of better security apparatus for each of the countries within their domestic territory. So these countries need each other, so they've developed a situation of what we call as mutualism, which is a plus plus for both the countries. Mutualism is of course a topic that we read in environment. In addition to mutualism, there are several other concepts we read. What are they? Mutualism, emensalism, commensalism, and so on. But there is something important which people usually miss out. It is called as proto cooperation. I also want you to write what this is in comment section. Proto cooperation could figure out in your prelims examination. देखो मैं predict नहीं कर रहा हूँ, but this is my anticipation because these are the kinds of areas in which UPSC could focus, because देखो म्यूचुअलिज्म तो नहीं पूछेगा, because mutualism everybody knows what it is. Anyway, so let's move forward. Let's look at the question for tomorrow. We'll open up the question for tomorrow for discussion. Ah, this looks like a fairly simple question, as in it is a straightforward question. It is just asking you to explain the strategic relation between India and Russia. There isn't much to discuss on this question. Open up discussion क्या होता है इसमें. It is just a single straightforward question, straightforward statement. It is asking you to explain the strategic relation between India and Russia. Now think about the side headings which you could evolve in this particular question. What is your thought process, the introduction, the body, and the conclusion that you would like to evolve? We will see the answer for the same tomorrow. Thank you.